The moment Dorian Ashvale realized something was wrong with his brother, Marcus was in the middle of winning an argument. This alone was not unusual. Marcus Ashvale had been winning arguments since he was old enough to form sentences, and he had refined the skill over 32 years into something close to an art form, a precise, elegant dismantling of opposing positions that left the loser uncertain whether they had been defeated or simply educated. He was the eldest of three, the presumptive heir to the Ashvale trading concern, and the kind of man who filled a room not by being loud, but by making the room arrange itself around him. Dorian had spent most of his 24 years admiring this quality and resenting it in approximately equal measure. What was unusual was the pause. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds, a gap in the middle of a sentence about import tariffs and the Crestford Bridge contracts, a sentence Marcus had clearly begun with full intention of completing. His eyes went briefly unfocused, tracking something to the left of the room's far wall, and then the focus returned, and he finished the sentence without inflection, without the small performative hesitation he normally employed before a rhetorical turn. Clean, mechanical, like a man reciting something he had memorized rather than a man thinking. No one else noticed. The family solicitor, Aldrin Voss, was reviewing his notes. Dorian's sister Petra was watching their father, monitoring his blood pressure the way she'd been monitoring it since his health had started to slip 2 years ago. Their father himself, Casimir Ashvale, sat at the head of the long oak table in the estate's formal sitting room with the specific stillness of a man conserving energy, his face giving nothing away. Only Dorian had nothing else to look at.
He was seated at the table's far end, the traditional position for the family member with the least stake in the proceedings, and he had nothing to review, no health to monitor, no strategy to project. He was present, as Petra had reminded him on the way in, because their father had required all 3 children present for the formal reading of the preliminary distribution. He was present, as Marcus had not said, but had made clear through the precise arrangement of documents that reserved no seat-side folder for Dorian's place, because excluding him would have raised questions. He was present the way furniture was present, occupying space, noted, not consulted. He watched Marcus finish the argument about the Crestford contracts, and he turned the 2-second pause over in his mind, and he said nothing. The Ashvale estate sat at the northern edge of Calter's Crossing, a prosperous mid-sized city of some 30,000 souls built along the confluence of 2 rivers, where trade from the interior met trade from the coast, and the resulting friction had over 2 centuries produced substantial wealth for a small number of families. The Ashvales were one of 4 merchant dynasties who had built the city's commercial backbone, and the current generation's inheritance dispute, triggered by Casimir's declining health and the ambiguous language of a will drafted 15 years ago, had been the subject of careful, expensive legal maneuvering for the past 8 months. Dorian had no legal maneuvering to do. His share of the inheritance, as outlined in the preliminary distribution, was a modest annual stipend and the use of the estate's secondary residence on Millward Street, a comfortable house that was also notably the farthest from the trade district of any property the family owned. It was the inheritance of someone to whom the family wished to remain financially obligated without conferring influence. He had known this was coming.
He had agreed with it internally in the way that people agree with assessments they have absorbed so thoroughly that they mistake them for self-knowledge. Dorian Ashvale had been told in 100 small ways across his entire life that he was not the sort of person on whom important things should depend. He was not stupid, even his detractors conceded a certain sharpness, but he was scattered, prone to fixating on details no one else considered relevant, uncomfortable with the performance of certainty that commerce required, and constitutionally incapable of walking past an interesting question to attend to a practical one. He had failed the merchant's apprenticeship his father had arranged. He had lasted 8 months with a guild surveyor before the guild politely suggested he might be better suited to work that didn't require him to stop investigating things and move on. He had spent the last 2 years reading, largely, in the Millward Street house, funded by an allowance that the family renewed without discussion because the alternative, Dorian attempting something independent, struck everyone as more trouble. He was not bitter about this. He had tried to be in his early 20s and found it required more sustained attention than the thing that usually replaced it, curiosity. He thought about the pause all the way home. He went back the next day on the pretext of retrieving a book he'd left in the sitting room, genuine pretext, he had left a book, though its retrieval was not urgent. And he watched Marcus for 40 minutes over breakfast and saw nothing strange. Marcus ate, Marcus spoke, Marcus managed 3 different household staff interactions with his usual precision and warmth. Nothing mechanical, nothing vacant. Dorian began to feel the familiar internal deflation of someone who has noticed something that turns out to be nothing, the specific embarrassment of a mind that generated patterns the way other people generated breathing.
Then Marcus poured his tea. He poured it wrong. Not catastrophically, the tea went into the cup did not spill, but wrong in the way that small automatic actions go wrong when the body is running on instruction rather than habit. Marcus Ashvale had been pouring his own morning tea for as long as Dorian could remember. He held the pot with his right hand, tilted from the wrist, kept his left hand at his side. It was a gesture as personally specific as a signature. That morning, he held the pot with both hands. He tilted from the elbow. He looked at the cup while he poured, the way you looked at something you were not certain you were doing correctly. It was the action of a man performing a memory rather than a man acting from one. Dorian picked up his book. He said goodbye. He walked home to Millward Street, through the autumn morning streets of Calder's Crossing, the kind of streets he had walked his entire life. The baker on Thornton Row opening his shutters, the fish seller arranging his cart at the river bridge end, the school children cutting across the Aldgate Square with the permanent urgency of people who were late. And he turned the tea pouring over in his mind, and underneath it the pause from the previous day, and he thought, something is wearing Marcus like a coat. He thought about who would believe him if he said this. He arrived at the answer quickly, because it was not a large list. It was in fact an empty one. He spent 3 days observing before he told anyone anything, because 3 days of observation was the minimum required to distinguish a pattern from a coincidence, and because telling someone without a pattern was the kind of thing that would end conversations before they started.
He visited the estate daily under various pretexts. A question for the solicitor, a book, a second book, once a third book, which prompted Petra to observe, with the brisk affection she expressed in lieu of warmth, that perhaps he ought to simply move the library to Millward Street and be done with it. He watched Marcus, he watched the staff, he watched Casimir, his father, who was present at meals more often now, which the family attributed to the inheritance proceedings bringing him out of his sick room, and who had a way of watching Marcus speak that Dorian found difficult to interpret at first, and then found himself interpreting with a cold feeling in his stomach. His father watched Marcus the way you watched a performance you had already seen. On the 4th day, Dorian visited the city archives. The city archives occupied the lower 2 floors of the Civic Hall on Aldgate Square, a building that had been many things over Calder's Crossing's history, and currently served as administrative headquarters for the City Council, the Merchant Guild Liaison Office, and the records repository for every legal, commercial, and civic document filed in the city since its founding. The archivist, a meticulous elderly gnome named Selwyn Doss, had been in the position for 40 years and had developed in that time the particular gnomish relationship with information, not just its collection and organization, but its ecology, the way facts existed in relationship to other facts, the significance of absence as much as presence. Dorian had known Selwyn since childhood, when he had discovered the archives at the age of 9 and spent 3 unauthorized hours there before anyone noticed he was gone. Selwyn had not reported him. He had instead handed him a systematic index to the building's contents and told him that if he was going to be in the archives, he was going to learn how to use them properly. It was the most educational afternoon of Dorian's life.
He laid his observations on the archivist's desk and did not pretend they were anything other than what they were. "I think someone is controlling my brother," he said. "I want to know if there are records of anything similar in the city. Missing persons, unusual behavioral changes, complaints about public figures acting strangely." Selwyn Doss was the second person in Dorian's life who did not treat his observations as symptoms of an overactive imagination. He read the notes. Dorian had written them in the precise, annotated style Selwyn had taught him, adjusted his reading spectacles, and said, "How long a window? Try 6 months. Expand to a year if nothing comes up." What came up, across the next 4 hours of careful cross-referencing, was this: 17 missing persons reports filed in the last 8 months, all in the northern half of the city, all involving adults between the ages of 20 and 50 who had last been seen in the river district near the Old Weaver's Quarter.
3 formal complaints filed with the city constabulary about council members behaving unlike themselves, all dismissed as personal disputes or the complaints of aggrieved parties in commercial cases. 1 physician's report, buried in the public health section, documenting 5 patients in the same month presenting with the same unusual symptoms: severe headache, temporary memory disruption, and a vacant quality to the eyes during what the physician had described as apparent absence episodes. Dorian read the physician's report 3 times. "Selwyn," he said, "do you know anything about creatures that affect the mind through proximity?" The gnome was quiet for a moment, the specific quality of quiet that meant he was deciding something. "I know what I've read," he said finally, "which is more than most people in this city. And what I've read suggests that if you're asking what I think you're asking, you should be very careful about who you tell." "I know."
"No," Selwyn said, gently and seriously. "I don't think you fully do yet, but you will." The Illithids. Dorian found the name in a restricted section of the archives, in a survey of extraplanar entities compiled by a traveling scholar 200 years ago and never updated, because the scholar had apparently decided that updating it was less important than leaving the city quickly, were not creatures of impulse. This was the first and most important thing the survey established. They were creatures of patience, of long architectural planning, of the kind of strategy that operated across years and decades rather than days. They did not conquer. They settled, slowly, beneath the surface of human institutions, extending influence through thralls, controlled individuals who retained enough surface function to pass unnoticed, and through the gradual accumulation of positioned power. The survey described the elder brain, the collective intelligence that coordinated Illithid activity, as operating like a tide, invisible from the surface until the water was already at your door. Dorian sat in the archive's reading room with this information and performed the calculation he had been unconsciously avoiding since the first day. If Marcus had been taken, if his father had been taken, the inheritance proceedings were not a family dispute, they were a mechanism. Someone, or something, needed the Ashvale trading concern positioned in a particular way. The Crestford Bridge contracts Marcus had been arguing for so precisely would give the family commercial control over the primary northern trade route into the city. A controlled family, advocating with the arguments and credibility of a respected merchant dynasty, could shift the entire structure of who moved what through Calder's Crossing and who paid whom for the privilege. The missing persons, the physician's report, the council complaints. 17 people vanished in the Weaver's Quarter, and the Weaver's Quarter was 2 blocks from the river, and the river ran beneath the oldest part of the city, and beneath the oldest part of the city were foundations that no current resident had ever had reason to excavate. He folded his notes. He thanked Selwyn. He walked out into the afternoon and stood in Aldgate Square and looked at the city he had grown up in, the baker, the fish seller, the school children, and tried to identify from the outside what compromise looked like. How many of these people were still themselves? How you would know the difference? He could not tell. That was, he supposed, the point. He went to Petra first, because she was the most pragmatic of his siblings, and pragmatism, he reasoned, might be more receptive than sentiment. She listened to everything. She sat in the parlor of the main estate. Marcus was out, their father resting, with her hands folded in her lap, and her expression carefully neutral, which Dorian had always known to mean she was deciding between multiple responses. He laid out the observations, the archive research, the extraplanar survey, the pattern of missing persons, and the geography of the Weaver's Quarter. When he finished, she said, "Dorian, I know how it sounds. Do you? Because it sounds like you have spent a week in the archives convincing yourself that Marcus is being controlled by a monster because he poured his tea wrong." She paused. "I say this with genuine concern for you, not for the theory." The pause, the tea, the physician's report, the 17 missing, are all things that have explanations that don't require extraplanar entities living under our city. She leaned forward. Marcus has been under extraordinary stress. Father's health, the proceedings, the contracts. Stress affects behavior. As for the archive records, Dorian, you can build a pattern out of anything if you look hard enough. You know this about yourself. The last sentence landed the way it was intended to. Not cruelly, but precisely. He did know this about himself. He had been told it often enough by people who were not wrong about the general tendency, and the difficulty was distinguishing the times the pattern was real from the times it wasn't. "I'm not wrong about this," he said.
You never think you're wrong, she stood. I'm going to ask you, as your sister, to step away from this. Focus on the settlement. Focus on the Millward Street house. Let the legal proceedings finish. She met his eyes. And if, in a month, something concrete happens, something I can see and not just read about, come back to me. He went to the solicitor next, then to a constabulary lieutenant who owed his father a professional courtesy. Then, in a moment he would later assess as optimistic, to Marcus himself, framing it as carefully as he could as a concern, a question, not an accusation. Marcus listened with the attentive, warm patience that Dorian recognized from 24 years of being the younger brother who needed explaining to. He asked 3 clarifying questions. He said that he understood Dorian was anxious about the proceedings, that stress manifested in unexpected ways, and that the family's physician could be arranged if Dorian needed support. There was nothing wrong in anything he said. The warmth was perfect. The patience was perfect. That was the worst part. He went alone, which was the only option available to him. The Weavers' Quarter had been a manufacturing district 2 generations ago and was now the city's least prosperous neighborhood, a warren of narrow streets and old buildings partially converted to tenements and workshops. It sat between the river and the old tannery district, smelling of both, the organic, working smell of water mixed with the chemical sharpness of old industrial residue.
The streets were busy during the day and genuinely unsafe at night, which was the reason Dorian went at midday and stayed near the main thoroughfares. He was looking for disappearances. He found instead a pattern of presence. The 17 missing persons from the archive records had last been seen in 3 specific streets: Loom Lane, Shuttle Alley, and the stretch of Weaver's Row between the Old Mill and the River Bridge. Those 3 streets intersected, roughly, in a triangular area centered on a building that the city's commercial register listed as a warehouse for a trading company called Mere Vast Goods, a company that, when Dorian requested its documents from the commercial archive, turned out to have been registered 8 months ago, to have filed no trade records, and to have listed as its registered agent a name that appeared nowhere else in the city's records. He walked past the warehouse 3 times on 3 different days, at different hours. On the first day, a single figure entered and did not leave during the 2 hours Dorian watched. On the second day, he counted 4 figures entering across a 6-hour period and none leaving. On the third day, Marcus Ashvale arrived in a carriage, entered through the side door, and emerged 40 minutes later with the slightly slower, more deliberate gait that Dorian had come to associate with the post-absent states, the moments after whatever it was that was done to controlled individuals was refreshed or adjusted. He stood behind a fish stall on Weaver's Row and watched his brother climb back into the carriage. He thought about the survey's description of the elder brain, the coordinating intelligence, described as physically enormous, permanently submerged in a pool of nutritive fluid, extending its authority through the telepathic lattice it maintained with its thralls.
He thought about what lay beneath the Weaver's Quarter: river bedrock, old foundations, the remains of 2 previous structures the city had built on top of rather than clearing. He thought about patience and tides and the architecture of slow infiltration. He thought about what a single person, unbelieved and unremarkable, could do against something like that. The answer was not reassuring, but it was not 0. He spent 4 days preparing, and the preparation clarified, in the way that action always clarified, the things that anxiety had been muddying. He was not a warrior. He had no combat training beyond the basic self-defense instruction all Calder's Crossing children received, which amounted to knowing how to break a grip and where to kick to create distance. He had no magic. He had no allies he could count on. What he had was the archive, a working knowledge of the city's layout and records, and the specific, underestimated capability of someone who noticed things that other people decided were not worth noticing. He researched illithid vulnerabilities with the focused intensity of a man running out of time, which he was. The survey was old, but it cited older sources, and those sources had been compiled from first-hand accounts, and the accounts contained, among the terror and the mystification, practical information. The elder brain was the keystone of the thrall network's coherence. Thralls without an elder brain experienced the disruption of the controlling frequency. Not liberation necessarily, but destabilization, a loosening of the signal that allowed fragments of original personality to resurface. Some recovered, some did not. The accounts were not comforting about this. Fire and radiant magic disrupted the illithid's concentration, broke the psionic focus that sustained both domination and their own combat capabilities.
Silver, interestingly, was not relevant. That was lycanthropes. Holy water had limited effect.
The Mind Blast, the cone of psychic force that temporarily incapacitated everything in its range, was their primary weapon, and the defense against it was not blocking, but distance. The effect degraded sharply beyond 30 feet, and at 40 feet was survivable without permanent damage if you had something to anchor your mind to. He kept coming back to the phrase, anchor your mind to. He thought about what anchored his. He thought about the archive and Selwyn's careful instruction. He thought about his mother, who had died when he was 11, and who had been the first person to suggest, gently but clearly, that the quality everyone else called scatteredness might be, in the right context, something else. He thought about the bone-deep familiarity of these streets, this city, the people going about their lives in the morning market outside his window. He could not protect all of them. He could, possibly, reach the thing that was coordinating the harm done to them. The warehouse had a basement. He was nearly certain of it. The city's construction records showed the building had been sited on the foundation of a much older structure, and the older structure had a cellar system that connected to the river maintenance tunnels the city's original builders had installed along the waterfront. Those tunnels were decommissioned, sealed, but they existed. He had the original construction survey in his notes. On the 5th day, he found Selwyn Doss in the archive at closing time and told him everything. Selwyn listened. He asked no clarifying questions. When Dorian finished, the gnome opened his dress drawer, produced a small metal object, a medallion on a cord, bearing a symbol Dorian recognized as belonging to an obscure philosophical order that the gnome had mentioned once years ago, and placed it around his own neck. The medallion offers some minor protection against telepathic influence, Selwyn said. A medallion of thoughts, antique, not standard issue.
It won't stop a direct mind blast. It will help you think clearly in the presence of the signal. He paused. I have worn it every day for 6 years. I have not told you why until now. Dorian looked at him. I noticed the pattern 18 months ago, Selwyn said. I am a gnome with an archive, not a soldier. I have been waiting for someone else to notice, and to be the kind of person willing to do something about it. He removed the medallion and placed it in Dorian's hands. Go tonight. The signal is strongest between midnight and dawn. That is when the elder brain is most active, managing the network. But it is also when the illithids themselves are most concentrated in the chamber, rather than ranging. Concentrated is better than ranging. Why? Dorian asked. Because, Selwyn said patiently, everything in one place can be burned. He went alone because the alternative was taking someone who trusted him into a situation he could not fully predict, and the weight of that was more than he could carry. He went with fire, 2 carefully constructed incendiary devices built from alchemist supplies purchased across 3 different shops so no single seller could identify the purpose, and with the construction survey memorized, and with Selwyn's medallion around his neck, and the sensation of it, which was not magical warmth, but the particular weight of something entrusted. The river tunnel entrance was behind a rusted maintenance gate that had not been opened in 20 years, and that opened when he applied leverage in the right place, with the quiet complaint of very old iron. The tunnel smelled of river and time. He moved by touch in the first section, by the small, careful light of a hooded lantern in the second, keeping the shutter mostly closed, trusting Selwyn's notes about the tunnel's direction. He heard the elder brain before he saw it. Not heard, felt. A pressure against the inside of his skull. Not the mind blast, but something ambient. The background radiation of a consciousness vast enough to constitute its own atmosphere. His thoughts tried to reorganize themselves around it, to accommodate it, the way a person's posture unconsciously adjusts to fill the shape of a chair. The medallion was warm against his chest. He kept his attention on Selwyn's face, a specific, deliberate act of anchoring, and the reorganization stopped. The chamber was enormous. He had expected something underground and close and wrong. The reality was underground and close and wrong in a way that was also undeniably ancient. Stone walls that predated the city above, carved with patterns that had no Calder's Crossing reference, a high vaulted ceiling that disappeared into shadow, and at the center of the chamber, a pool of fluid that caught the light from the bioluminescent organisms growing along the walls and turned it something between green and gray, the color of deep water seen from above. The elder brain floated in the pool.
It was approximately the size of a large barrel, pale and faintly translucent, the lobes of it pulsing in slow, arrhythmic waves. 3 illithids stood at the pool's edge, the mind flares in their full, undisguised reality, 7 foot, slender, with the octopoid facial tentacles that tasted the air with the same patient curiosity that the survey had described. They were not, at this moment, looking in his direction. They were conducting something, a process that involved the pool and a human figure standing at its edge with the empty, upright stillness of a thrall being worked on. The human figure was his father. Dorian Ashvale stood in the shadow of the tunnel entrance and experienced in quick succession horror, grief, fury, and the specific cold clarity that arrives when emotion is too large for the moment, and the moment requires action regardless.
He understood, looking at his father, what the next 10 seconds were going to cost him. He threw the first incendiary into the pool. He threw the second at the nearest illithid. He pulled his father by the arm. The old man turned, eyes vacant, resisting with the passive, confused resistance of someone whose commands were not coming from his own brain, and ran. The chamber behind him made a sound he would never be able to adequately describe. The mind blast caught him at the tunnel's first turning. He had known it was coming. He had felt the pressure building in the 2 seconds between the throwing and the running, the gathering charge of something that operated at a frequency below hearing. And he had pressed his back to the stone wall and put his father in front of him, which was not heroism, but geometry. The illithid was behind them, not ahead, and his body was larger. The cone of psychic force hit him in the left side and the back, and the effect was not pain, but dissolution. A catastrophic interruption of every thought he was in the middle of. A sudden and absolute blankness that lasted perhaps 3 seconds, but felt like falling from a great height and forgetting what falling was. He came back to himself with his cheek against the tunnel wall and his father sitting heavily on the ground beside him, blinking, and the sound from the chamber behind them was changing. The coherent, organized resonance of the elder brain's broadcast was fracturing, taking on the quality of interference, of signal interrupted. The fire, the pool. He reached for his father's arm. The old man looked at him, not through him, not with the mediated vacancy of a man receiving instructions, and said his name in a voice that was confused and frightened, and with absolute certainty his own. "Dorian, what?" "Walk," Dorian said. "Please, I'll explain everything later. Walk." They walked. The network did not collapse instantaneously. This was something Dorian had understood intellectually from the survey, and now understood in the direct, inescapable way of experience. The elder brain's death, which he was not yet certain of, and would not be certain of for 2 more days, disrupted the control signal. But disruption was not liberation. It was the difference between a puppet's strings going slack and a puppet becoming a person. The slack came immediately. The personhood came back in pieces, at different rates, for different people, and some of the pieces did not come back at all. Marcus, released from 6 months of deep control, spent 3 days barely speaking. When he did speak, it was in fragments, half-remembered decisions, contracts signed, arguments made, all of them now recognizable as having been pointed in a single direction. The Crestford contracts, the trade routes, the steady accumulation of commercial influence over the northern city. He remembered none of it as compulsion. He remembered it as his own thinking. The horror of this, the knowledge that something had occupied the space behind his thoughts and used them against him, was a thing Dorian could not help him with, except by being present. Petra came to the Millward Street house on the 2nd day. She sat down across from Dorian and did not speak for a long moment. Then she said, "Tell me what you need." He told her. She wrote it down. She was, as he had always known, magnificent at implementation when the decision had been made for her. The city constabulary's investigation of the Weaver's Quarter warehouse and the tunnel system beneath it produced over the following week evidence sufficient to reopen every dismissed complaint and missing persons case.
2 of the 17 missing persons were recovered and states that the physician, the same one who had filed the original report, who had been quietly advocating for attention to these cases for 8 months, described as profound but potentially survivable psychological reconstruction. 3 others had not survived, not the initial takeover, but the reversal,
minds too thoroughly rewritten to withstand this signal's sudden absence. The remaining 12 were found in various states of awareness, ranging from complete disorientation to a kind of functional clarity that had no emotional texture, like a room where the furniture was in the right places but the windows had been painted over. The 3 illithids from the chamber were not found. Dorian had not expected them to be. They were patient creatures, and the city had other entrances and other foundations and other dark places where patience could be exercised. He filed this information in the part of his mind that did not stop working on a problem because the immediate crisis had passed. He stood in the civic hall 2 weeks after the night in the tunnel and gave a deposition to a council committee that contained, for the first time in his life, people who were writing down what he said as though it mattered. The experience was so unfamiliar that he had to pause twice to make sure he was reading it correctly. Selwyn Das sat in the gallery and took his own notes, in the precise annotated style he had been teaching for 40 years, and when Dorian caught his eye, the gnome gave a small, deliberate nod. The hardest part was not the council. It was not the investigation or the recovery efforts, were the 7 separate conversations with Marcus, each one circling the same unresolvable center. I didn't know. I would have stopped it if I could have. I don't know who I was for those 6 months. I don't know if any of those decisions were mine. The hardest part was a conversation with his father.
Casimir Ashvale had recovered more fully than Marcus. The control had been lighter, more recent, used less for active direction and more for passive assent, the nodding agreement at the right moments, the approval of decisions that had already been made. He sat in the main estate sitting room, the oak table between them, and looked at his youngest son with the undefended expression of a man who had recently had several assumptions removed by force. "How long did you know?" he asked. "I suspected for about a week before I had enough to act on." "And you told no one?" "I told everyone," Dorian said. "No one believed me." His father was quiet. Outside, Calder's Crossing went about its morning. The baker, the fish seller, the schoolchildren. The ordinary maintenance of a city that did not know how close it had come to becoming something else. "I made a mistake," Casimir said. "About you." Dorian considered how to respond to this. He had imagined this conversation, or versions of it, for most of his life, and the imagined versions had contained more satisfaction than the real one did. The real one mostly made him tired, and underneath the tired, the thing he had always been better at than he was given credit for, the understanding of why something had happened, the architecture of the mistake, the recognition that his father had assembled his assessment of his youngest son from real evidence, improperly weighted and poorly updated. "You made several," Dorian said, without heat. "I made some too. We have time to recalibrate." His father looked at him. For the first time in Dorian's memory, Casimir Ashvale did not have a prepared response. "Yes," his father said after a moment. "We do." 6 months after the night in the tunnel, Selwyn Das posted a new acquisition notice in the archives reading room.
It was brief. Type it in the gnome's characteristic compressed notation, and it announced the addition of a new section to the restricted collection, a comprehensive survey of extraplanar threats, psionic influence, and verified historical incursion events in Calder's Crossing and the surrounding region, compiled from primary sources, first-hand accounts, and original investigation notes. The survey was cross-indexed by date, by entity type, by geographical location, and by the methodology used to identify the threat in its early stages. The author was listed as D. Ashvale, Research Consultant, Civic Archive. It was the first official title Dorian had ever held. It paid less than the family stipend and required considerably more work, and he had accepted it without hesitation. The restricted section also contained, in a sealed folder marked Ongoing, a secondary file. It held copies of the 3 illithids' last known movement patterns, cross-referenced with construction surveys for the eastern and southern quarters of the city, a list of 14 names, people in positions of civic and commercial influence, flagged for what Dorian had labeled behavioral inconsistencies worth monitoring, and a map of the city's underground infrastructure annotated in red ink. The file was updated weekly. The 2 illithids that had not been found were patient creatures. Dorian Asheville had learned over the course of a very eventful year that patience was not their exclusive property. He came in every morning, made tea, holding the pot with his right hand, tilting from the wrist, the way he had always done it, and opened the file. He had a great deal of work left to do.